So that brings us into our Q&A session here. I was at a presentation last week from the South Dakota No-Till Association. They brought in a producer out of, he's east of Detroit in, I think that's Ontario. Yeah, that's still Ontario. And he was talking about oxymorons in agriculture, and one of the things he brought up was sales agronomist feels like an oxymoron to him. So when you get an agronomist like Brian, Anthony, you work in agronomy, someone who's working primarily in your interest rather than to sell something is something that's really good to have in your corner. So with that being said, if you do have a question, do raise your hand. We'll get you the microphone. I have a question for Brian right away, actually. I don't know where he went to. I didn't see you talk about Select. So I don't remember the chemical name of Select, but I've been considering Select as an option for someone who does have a lot of brome or Kentucky bluegrass as a grass-specific herbicide, whether it could be used. And I don't know if you have any familiarity with that one or not. Maybe I'm putting you on the spot and you aren't that familiar with it.
No, I know Select. I think it's a sethoxidum. So, let me look.
You could lie or you wouldn't know.
Oh, here we go. Sorry, it's pulling up.
So, we got a question here too. Again, I'll just give you a little bit of background. If you're thinking, depending on what your goals are, it's particularly around native flowers or forbs, legumes, Select as a selective typically towards grass species. That's a lot of where I see it used. People throw it in on soybeans to help take out volunteer corn, that type of thing. Wondering if it's something that would be viable in a restoration scenario, or what cautions you may have around something like Select. And maybe Anthony, I know you've worked with some of these too. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this. No, okay, he's shaking his hand. It's back to Brian.
Yeah, okay, so clethodim. Select is clethodim.
Okay.
And so it's annual grasses.
Annual grasses.
Yes.
Okay.
So that's kind of what it targets. It does get some perennial stuff too, but it's used in a lot in sunflowers and
okay.
And things.
So if
like
someone had a lot of foxtail potentially, would it be safe towards their other grasses?
I would have to read the label on it.
Okay.
Before I could give you a 100% answer.
So it depends. This is why this is a fun subject.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Pete has a question, and then I'll read this one.
Oh, go. You can do that one first.
Okay. So a couple questions here. First one, has there been any research or case studies on restoring the fungal or microbial communities prior to reintroducing native plants? And that may be, I don't know if that's through compost or cover crops, but the question is research or case studies. Right now, that's looking.
I'll pop up just with my regenerative background and say I don't know of any particular published case studies. I know there's been some on-farm stuff.
Sure.
With some producers, but fortunately, and Kent may disagree with me here, but I think that our soils are pretty resilient enough that if we did establish grasses and we got that native community back, that we're going to get that bacteria, microbial stuff creep in from native areas pretty quickly.
Sure.
What if you're not near native areas?
You got a fence line, you got a native area. You got a tree belt, you got a native area. Native microbiome. So when I say native, meaning it's undisturbed. If you have a fence line, you can pull a soil test out of a fence line and walk 20 feet away into a crop field, and the phospholipid fatty acid profile is astronomically different because it's undisturbed. You're not getting that chemical overlap. You're not getting that tillage. You're not getting whatever, even in the fence line. It can be that close. I do know of research done in Georgia and North Carolina where they took all these humates, all this, I call it bug in a jug, and they applied them, and they found the most microbial activity restored into a crop field is where they took topsoil out of a tree belt and composted it and applied it.
That actually relates to the second part of this question, which was, are native microbes and fungi lying dormant in the soil and then become active after native plants are reintroduced? And then in South Dakota, has there been any work cultivating indigenous microorganisms from intact ecosystems and applying them onto sites via foliar spray?
We'll lean on Kent.
Is Kent here?
Did Kent leave?
Must have stepped out.
The two soils guys, the other guy here.
Jay's over there.
Jay?
I don't know if you have anything you want to add to it.
Well, I can't had to leave, so I'll take a stab at it. But the analogy we use a lot is that with tillage and everything, if you have a tornado coming through your house every year and you rebuild every year, eventually you're just going to say, the hell with it, I'm not going to rebuild my house every year. That's what we use. That's how the biology in the soil is too. If you keep destroying it every year, it's going to leave. And so when you have them areas that are not being disturbed, like your tree belts or your fence lines or the ditch where they're not being destroyed, then they seem to creep back in. They seem to leave the area and then come back. So they're not dormant. The only time they really go dormant is when winter frost. But other than that, they leave before they'll come back.
Sure. Do you want to follow up with a question or a comment?
Different question, but unless
ahead.
there's more discussion on this. That's good. Thank you for that answer, though, too, by the way. You know, those little tiny pockets. No, my question was more specific on, I get confused on my chemistry sometimes. So on that list, talk to us a little bit more about, so atrazine isn't on there, or maybe it is and I'm just not recognizing it. And then the paraquat. So those two in particular.
Okay, so these are just common herbicides that I pulled up. A lot of people are getting away from the triazonines just because of their residual. There's been some research where there's triazonines, or the half-lives are so astronomically long that they are still remaining deep in the soil years, 30, 40 years later. So paraquat. What's your question on paraquat, Pete? What do you want to know about paraquat?
I'm not all that familiar with paraquat. So when you were describing it, to me it sounded like, so Roundup's not systemic. Well, is systemic. Paraquat is not. So does it actually kill anything then, or how does it work? Or what, is it safer? I guess is my question.
Okay, paraquat history. Paraquat is Agent Purple. Okay, paraquat was developed in pre-Vietnam era. It's a defoliant. Okay, so all it does is it burns chemically what it touches. So you could literally spray today, right now. Go right now and spray if you were in the right conditions, and come back in a couple hours, and everything's going to be black. So it just burns what it touches. So the problem with that is it doesn't take it to the root, nor does it burn the growing point on grasses and stuff. So what that does is it knocks it back, and then whatever it knocked back, say it's grass, say it's brome grass, all that's going to do is that growing point is going to come back and go out. Safer. I mean, it has its benefits, but it also has its downsides. Like, again, it doesn't take it to the root. So if you're dealing with, like, annual stuff, like or a biannual, like a lot of thistles are biannual, okay, you get them before they're in the rosette stage, you can fry them, okay, good. Then you're one up on that, and you get establishment in there. But as far as, getting a residual, whereas like something like glyphosate or 2,4-D or something is going to take herbicide to the root and actually kill the root out with it, then it's not.
Okay, I'm going to ask another question here, and then I'll read this one. So there was a little bit of talk in Kent's discussion about cover crops, and I think there's been a lot of interest over the years. Pete, pay attention, because I'm going to be calling on you. There's been a lot of interest over the years when we talk about the loss of soil health, the loss of soil microbiology, as well as these herbicide residuals. What about cover crops? Can we do a couple years of cover crops as a precursor to planting native species to help boost our soil biology, get away from some of these herbicide residuals? I know there are some, you talked about the Carolyn Eck project, you did a cover crop there. There's other projects, I believe, Owen, you've worked with some on some of your projects. I was wondering if you guys would be willing to share what we do know, what we don't know, just initially what we've learned, because I know you've presented on this once or twice as well. So I think it'd be really interesting to people just to know what do we know and what don't we know about cover crops as a bridge towards quicker establishment, essentially.
So I didn't tell Josh this, but we've actually got a whole presentation on this tomorrow.
Okay, well.
So I'm actually going to cover a comparison of 4 or 5 different cover crop trials that we did with a no chemical option on the cover crop. So I don't know, probably should just wait on that till tomorrow, if that's okay, Josh, because or else it's going to be pretty confusing.
I guess that's their hook to come back tomorrow.
I guess so,
Be
yeah.
here.
That was all staged.
If that's your question, stick around, because I think there's a lot of things to learn from that. All right, couple questions. I think this is a good one. This one's probably going to go to you, Jay, so just be ready. Does cropping change the soil characteristics so much that soil surveys are no longer valid?
Sure, ask the range guy about something like that.
Well, Kent's not here.
Boy, Anthony, you got anything you really want to add to this after I screw this up? Okay, great. From what I know is that, yes, it can. We've seen where the soil was surveyed decades ago, back in the 30s and 40s, and the pH was about 7.1. You go back to those sites again, the pH has risen. So, is that due to disturbance, tillage, or is it due to the chemical application? I don't know, but I know it's screwing up the soil somehow. Anthony, you got anything else you want to add on that?
Yeah, the answer is absolutely, and it's called erosion. So anytime you change the description of that soil, it's a different soil. And Iowa's done some research on that. They went back and looked at soils that were mapped previously and came back, and I forget what percent of them had been changed, but they changed. You're not, this pH thing, exposing our subsoils, the pH of our subsoils is higher. So if you erode the top off, you're going to get closer to that higher pH material. Humankind is manipulating soils. I mean, I don't know what else to say. Organic matter? Well, if you farm the heck out of it, you're going to lose your organic matter, right? That can have an impact. Our mollisols fit a certain characteristic. You got to have a certain depth of dark material, right? And if you decrease that dark material, it becomes an altisol then, not a mollisol. So, yeah, it's happening right before our eyes.
All right. I have 2 questions. This one's Anthony, just keep it, because I think you'll want to address this one, and then I think Brian will have something he can say. So when do you consider resistance in spraying? Spray until you see a resistance problem, or is there a timeline to switching herbicides? Specifically, I'm thinking in grasslands, but talk about it more generally. When do you start thinking about resistance?
Well, you should think about resistance all the time. You don't want to get caught up in doing the same thing over and over and over, and that was the problem with Roundup Ready crops. And I'll be a testament, it happened on our farm. But it is happening all over. They made it so easy to fall into that trap that that's what happened. So basically, glyphosate is just a grass herbicide today. It still kills a few broadleaves, but it's basically a grass herbicide. So you have to think about that. And that's what a crop rotation does for you, is it forces you out of that pattern. That corn and bean thing with Roundup resistant crops every year, that's what led to Roundup resistant weeds. And it's just nature adapting to its pressure. That's called selection pressure. So what was said a plant wants to do, what does a plant want to do every year? Grow seed, but it only needs one, right? One seed. And that's how resistance starts, is you see these plants that are very stunted by the chemical application, and they survive to produce that seed for another year, and then that plant grows and you apply that chemical again, and that happens again, and then it happens really quickly. So resistance management should be first and foremost in your mind all the time.
And I'll kick in with that from the chemical side of things too. In management decisions, is like Anthony said, rotations are critically important, but also chemical rotation. We know now, after this Roundup resistant weed epidemic that we have been thrown into, that so if you look at a chemical label, there's a black box with a number in it, and that's a mode of action that chemical takes. So now, as agronomic experts, we all look for different modes of action, and oftentimes in a single pass, we look for multiple modes of actions on the same weeds. So we mix it up, and I guess it would be the old adage of you keep it guessing. So that way you don't develop resistance. One of the things I will say too is follow label rates. I grew up in North Carolina, Christmas tree capital of the world, and in the 90s, North Carolina State University came out with this thing called chemical mowing, because Christmas trees are a 6 to 10 year crop. So you plant them, and they came out with this ultra low rates of Roundup where we could use basically 10 ounces of Roundup per acre to kill grass and keep white clover in between the Christmas trees to prevent soil erosion and recycle nutrients, et cetera, et cetera. Well, guess what? We got Roundup resistant mare's tail, giant ragweed, everything you can imagine because of that. There and again, it's one of those things we're kind of a victim of our own self, but different modes of action and paying attention to growth stages. There are certain chemicals that work, like, for example, if you're spraying anything in the amaranth family, there's certain chemicals that says anything greater than 6 inches, you don't spray it. So that's part of management. You're scouting. Kochia, at certain stages, I don't care, you could hit it with diesel fuel and a torch and it's not going to kill it. But just knowing that and being able to follow labels and follow rates and know what you're dealing with is probably one of the most critical stages or critical things that we can do is to prevent any further resistance.
Okay. Sounds good. The next question I have oh,
No, you're good.
do you want to do your question first? There you go.
You can do yours. You sure? Yeah. You sure? I
Yep.
think you should do your question first.
No, you're ready. You got the microphone.
So I don't know. I mean, this is kind of a big question, and I'm not going to beat around the bush with it or anything like that, but when are we going to stop with the chemical usage on the landscape? And what does that look like?
That relates to this question. There was the request is to discuss a non-chemical option for establishing native grass.
Non-chemical would be, like Kent and others have alluded to, from our experience with Ducks Unlimited and my personal experience would be a lot of cover crops, a lot of grazing, and taking multiple weed cycles out. That would be probably one of the ways that would be probably the most successful without chemicals.
Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of restorationists in the room, so like there's not a tremendous amount of post planting chemical use in today's I would say targeted restorations. It's what we're talking about here a lot of times is inherited chemical use or intentional chemical use. Maybe if you're working with a producer, like that one crop before you really go into it, if you can kind of direct their management plan for that particular year, if they're going to crop anyway. You know, a lot of times you think about the cycle that we're talking about, established grassland, CRP program lands, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of times, you know, you're going to be going into that 1 year prior to, or like one growing season prior to. So you try to shift that management toward a more friendly soil bed, you know, for the planting. And I think that's mostly what we're talking about here, or inherited chemical history. You know, I don't think we're advocating, at least I'm not anyway. I can't speak for everybody. I'm certainly not advocating for a whole bunch of chemicals out on the landscape. But where we do have super heavy weed pressure, like what some of the stuff that Brian discussed or that Jesse discussed, I think then the phase two of this question is, what do we do? You know, I struggle with chemicals a lot, but I want to get away from it. But short-term investment, long-term gain, can we knock something right out of the system and then have a really good grassland establishment? I think that's also what we're talking about here as well. The thing that we haven't touched on much is what does this mean for just broadcast chemical application across grasslands, right? I mean, this whole forum is focused mostly on restoration, but we go way deep into this when we're talking in the field about long-term management. And I think I speak for most of at least our larger team here, that we're really trying to move away from chemicals, you know, and post-establishment management.
I would say, he's got his hand up. I would say the thing is with chemicals is it's a tool, so know how to use it.
I would be in the boat of, yeah, I don't see why we need to use it. Ecological succession is what we're trying to follow here, and many of these annuals are native. Of course, there's some that are introduced, but it's the same thing. The earth wants to cover its dirt. So having weeds out there to me is not a freak out moment. It's understanding what we're doing after planting. Of course, CRP handcuffs us a little bit, limits us on what we could do, but maybe that's a move that we need to start trying to ask for, is different modes of maintenance after establishing things on these larger programs. Things that we know work better than just, one-time mowing and we're going to call it good. You know, 'cause we're trying to get like mimicking nature and everything else. Well, that's exactly what we're doing in restoration. Earth wants its dirt covered, something's supposed to cover it, then the perennials come along slowly through management. Obviously, you leave it idle, it's not going to work, and that's where we're trying to depend on these chemicals, and that's just not a thing. So that's where I would say leave that.
I would say just broadly too, one of the things to consider is just what other tools do you have. Dakota gave a really good introduction to forces that have shaped the grasslands in the past. So I think there are places that you could use intensive managed grazing to prepare a seed bed, certainly fire, mechanical use, haying, mowing, something like that. I think all of those are options, but there again, they need to be targeted just like anything you're doing with chemical. Would you disagree, anyone? I mean, they're options. Those are other options. More to come. Got another question right here in the middle.
Sorry, can I follow up to that one
Oh,
more
yeah,
thing.
sure.
The gentleman over there was talking about how crop rotation, thinking about like crop rotations and chemical rotations and things like that, and how crop rotation gets you out of that pattern of thinking. And I just wonder, like, as we continue to rely on chemicals on the landscape, like we're just in that pattern of thinking where it's like, oh, there's weeds, we need to go treat them with chemical. And what happens when we just stop using the chemical and force ourselves to solve the problems that we're looking at from a different angle? There's an Albert Einstein quote that I keep thinking of that's like, you can't solve your problems from the same mindset that you were in when you created them in the first place. And I just feel like we've been spraying weeds for, however many years now, forever, as long as I've known about conservation, and we're not getting anywhere. I mean, the problem's not going away. So, I don't know, just something to think about.
Okay, so I don't think there's probably anybody in this room that actually disagrees with you at all on that, or I know I don't. It's just like the long game, right? Like, and that's why I think what we're really trying to focus here is on that establishment phase. And I know I'm not advocating for much use at all of chemicals in establishment. I think we wanted to do this session just to get to the point that you're making, right? It is so complex. There's so many layers, like, if we can just get away from it, right? And I think on the grassland landscape, we have to move that direction. Like the big picture. I know personally, I stopped using chemicals on my place a long time ago, and I've never been happier. And guess what? I have the same weed problems I had back then. So it's like, truly, like it just, I think you got to just kind of get to a point of like quality of life, I'm not saying that you're going to get away with that in crop ground. But I will share a story, though, to your point. I got in an argument about 20 years ago with about an 80-year-old weed soup from one of the eastern South Dakota counties. We were trying to find out something different for leafy spurge management across vast landscapes, right? You probably are familiar with spurge bugs. And he said, he was really upset that we were trying to do something different. And he said something to the effect of, like, damn it, we've been spraying spurge for 60 years and it's the only thing that works. And I'm like, well, if you've been spraying spurge for 60 years, I would say it maybe doesn't work, and he didn't like that too much, but it's a paradigm. So I don't know what else to say about it.
Sure. One more question right down here, and then we'll go to break.
Thank you. Example, if I buy 80 acres that's been in corn and beans for forever, and I want to plant it to warm season grass, do I let it set for a year and let it grow weeds, or do I just go and plant my warm season grass and take my chances?
Brian, you want to take that one?
You're going to be fighting weeds either before or after. So if you let it sit and kind of control the weeds, then you can maybe get a jump on it. My initial suggestion would be do a cover crop, multi-species cover crop, take a weed cycle out, and then next fall or that fall do a dormant seeding. Because if you've been corn beans, you got a weed bank. I don't care how much chemical. It's like we all just had this conversation in here. There's weeds there. There are going to be weeds there. So it's either you fight them on the front end, or you plant and you're going to be fighting them after your grass is in the ground. So as a manager, I would suggest doing a multi-species cover crop and then grazing that or something, and then doing your dormant seeding after the fact to take a weed cycle out.
Brian, is there a point where he would want to take a soil test to see what chemicals he still has as well?
Yeah, when the soil's 52 degrees, you could pull a soil sample then and go down 2 feet, 0 to 6 and 6 to 24, send it off, and you could see what chemicals were present, and then you could do that in the spring, and then you could know what you're working with, and then you could adjust your seed mix accordingly.
Right. check for atrazine. and
Yeah,
that sort of stuff.
atrazines and any of the metrozones or any of that.
Did you have something to add to that?
Well, you kind of took what I was going to say, but I would pose the question, how many of us actually do the soil test as this resource on this? I don't think we do it hardly much at all, especially when it comes to CRP. Most landowners aren't willing to wait, but if we knew it was out there, we knew, because there's always fears. There's always that fear that what's out there, oh my God, we can't put Forbes in there because, well, you don't know what you don't know. So if we're not taking the soil test, we tell farmers every day that you're overusing fertilizer if you're not doing soil tests, then what are we doing? We should be taking that test to see what's out there. We actually had the opportunity to do this on a producer's place to do some testing. You know, they didn't go into CRP on some stuff and just did it on their own, and there was sorghum with atrazine put on it. And so, of course, that was a big worry, and basically the soil test came back that we would have assumed would have been negative, and it wasn't. So in this case, it worked out that we could do a diverse mix, and it was fine. The alternative could have also been possible, but without that test, we wouldn't have known.
Sure. Do you know what a soil test costs for a chemical? Maybe you do. You don't know. Do you know, Pete, right offhand, just a chemical test for soil?
I know, well, okay, so I don't know the answer to that exactly, because that was going to be part of my next question. I know we got to kind of go to break here, but I know that I had several issues that I've been involved with over the years with chemical overspray. And one of the questions that I've always asked was, you know, if you're familiar with that process, when Department of Ag comes in, they do a lot of surveys around the area to figure out what people were spraying first before they actually send the samples in to get the chemical test. And I needed clarification on that, and they said the reason is that to do a broad spectrum chemical test is super expensive. If you don't know what you're actually targeting and telling the lab what to look for in the chemistry, it gets really expensive because it's just like throwing darts. So I guess I ask you, Brian or Anthony, when you do a chemical, or where's Jesse? Jesse's back there. When Wilbur had his chemical test, did he provide a preset list that they were asked to test for, or was it an open-ended question that said, hey, tell me what chemicals are in my soil? Because I've been under the understanding that the second question is super expensive. Is it? Okay, so the answer, I'm gonna reiterate that answer. Jesse said that the chemical test came back with chemical classes or groupings that were, you know, similar chemicals. So that was Wilbur's experience. Anthony, or does anybody know if what I'm asking is there any truth to it, that you have to kind of try to provide some level of a list ahead of time, or can you do a broad spectrum chemical test on soils?
You should know what you're looking for. I mean, when they do that survey, they that you were talking about, Pete, that's why they're doing it. So if they identify 2 or 3 compounds, then they'll test for those.
Okay.
You don't want to do a broad spectrum unless your checkbook is bottomless.
Okay, so
You know.
I'm going to speak on behalf of a few of our producers in the room that that I've spoken with, just to protect some personal integrity here. You would not believe the roadblock that people are getting, that I'm hearing about fairly frequently, trying to get chemical history from a previous operator. I don't know if it's a personal insult, if it's comes off as you're double checking, or they want to hold those records close to the vest. I've been through it myself. I've met others that have been through it. So it's hard to know what to ask for if you can't get the base information for what was maybe applied. So that's just something that I think, I'm just sharing that as information. So try to figure out how to ask real nicely, because it's not a guaranteed yes that you're going to get a chemical history on a field.
All right. Matt,
Some
did you still
insight.
have one? I saw you wave your hand a little bit ago. I don't know if you have a question or an answer.
Yeah, just to reverse that a little bit.
Here comes a microphone.
If we know what they're going to plant, and I know this is an open question, and I'm not expecting somebody to answer this. If we know what they are planting, that seed mix, is there certain chemicals that we should be looking out for? I guess.
Yep. Good point. Dawn?
That's That's what I was gonna say is, then can we say, look for these 5?
Sure.
Are these the ones that's gonna be detrimental?
Yep. So narrowing down to what might be detrimental, since you don't know, if you just bought the land, narrow it down. That may be something to work with a biologist on, as these ones tend to have the most effect on our native warm season grasses, and test for those. All right. You did have your hand up.
What's super expensive? $1,000, $10,000? What's super expensive? $1,000 or $10,000?
I don't know, Anthony, do you know what a soil test costs? That's why I asked that before. What's a super expensive soil test cost?
Just go to
Hold on.
Google it.
Google says between 50 and 500.
Okay, thanks, Courtney. Between 50 and 500, so super expensive, let's say 500 might be your test to know what you got. All right, we are definitely into our break here, but I really appreciate the discussion. We are going to give you 15 minutes, so we will reconvene here at 3:25.